At verse 25, it says once again, and David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord was entreated for the land and the plague was stayed from Israel. As you go further in the story, the Bible tells us that when David's heart smote him, his conscience, God began to deal with him through his conscience. That when he woke up the next morning, God had directed the prophet Gad to go to David and tell him, David, there are consequences to your actions. And so God gave him an option. And the option was this. The consequences for you, David, and you can choose which one you want, is 7 years of a famine in the land, 3 months running from your enemies, or 3 days pestilence or plague, or if you want to put it in today's language, 3 days the land would have to deal with the pandemic. David thought about it and said, as he will later tell us even in the Psalm, it's better to trust in the Lord than to trust in man. It's better to trust in the Lord than to trust in princes. So David threw himself on the mercies of God, and he chose the 3 days of pestilence. And so an angel was dispatched by God, and he unsheathed his sword. And the Bible tells us that 70,000 people died. But because God is merciful and God is compassionate, the Bible tells us that God stayed the hand of the angel. And then God tells the prophet Gad to go tell David, this is what I want him to do. I want him to go to the house of this man, and what I want him to do, I want him to build an altar. So when David gets to the man's house, he wants to purchase the threshing floor so that he can offer up an offering to God. The man wants to give it to David. But David says something that is so profound. He says, I will not offer something unto the Lord that didn't cost me anything. One of the things you learn in life is that sacrifice is always costly. And so the Bible tells us in verse 25 that David built the altar. What was it that God wanted? What was it that God was after? What is the lesson that we can learn from this? Listen to what it says again. And David built there an altar unto the Lord. The altar was a consecrated place where sacrifices were made and gifts were presented to God. It was a place of sacrificial and reverent devotion. But David was no longer giving wholehearted devotion to God by putting his full faith and trust in the Lord as his Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who will provide. By sending out the men to take a census, and notice, they really didn't count all the people. They were counting the men that could be used to muster up an army. David is no longer relying totally on God as he did when he was a young man, when he went out and fought Goliath with a sling and 5 stones. He was no longer doing what he had told us to do when he told us in the Psalms, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And so what God is looking for David to do is to not rely on his army, not even rely and not be full of himself and his pride, and rely on the things that God had provided him with and the position that God had put him in. What God is wanting from David is to be first in David's life. And you know, God still looks for the same thing today. He wants to be first in our lives. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33 says, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. God says, if you put me first, I will make sure that everything else you need will be provided. David, now king, had become more dependent on his blessings than he was on the blesser. And so the lesson that we're learning is, no matter how much God has blessed us, times like these are a reminder that we still need God.